You're not limited by your reality. You are limited by the instructions running silently inside your mind. And the shocking truth is, most of those instructions were never chosen by you, but they can be rewritten in an instant. Your subconscious mind is not a distant part of you that you occasionally access. It is the silent foundation of everything you are experiencing right now. It does not argue with you, it does not analyze your logic, and it does not question whether something is good or bad for you. It simply absorbs what is repeated, what is felt deeply, and what is imagined with emotion, and then it begins to treat that as reality. Most people live without realizing that every repeated thought is becoming a command. Every repeated emotion is becoming a direction. Every repeated image in the mind is becoming a blueprint for future experience. This is not poetic imagination. This is the operating system of human behavior working quietly underneath conscious awareness. When you think the same thought again and again, it is no longer just a thought. It becomes a pattern. And when a pattern is repeated enough times, the subconscious mind stops questioning it and starts executing it automatically. This is why fear becomes a personality trait for some people, why confidence becomes natural for others, and why certain individuals seem to attract similar experiences over and over again. It is not luck, it is programming. The subconscious is constantly listening, even when you are not aware of it listening. It records your inner dialogue, it stores your emotional reactions, and it builds a mental model of who you believe you are and what you believe your life should be. What makes this process even more powerful is that the subconscious mind does not distinguish between something physically happening and something vividly imagined. If you repeatedly imagine failure with strong emotion, your subconscious begins to accept failure as a familiar outcome. If you repeatedly imagine success with clarity and feeling, it begins to accept success as familiar instead. Familiarity is everything to the subconscious mind. It moves you toward what feels known, not necessarily what is logically correct. This is why change feels uncomfortable at first, because anything new has not yet been accepted as familiar within the inner programming. Every day, without realizing it, people are reinforcing their internal script. Thoughts of limitation become instructions. Doubts become reinforcement. Memories of past failure become evidence stored in the subconscious archive. And over time, this creates a loop where the outer world seems to reflect the inner world. But in reality, it is the inner world that has been silently shaping the outer experience from the beginning. Nothing enters your life without passing through this invisible filter of belief and repetition. Even your identity is built this way. The subconscious mind holds onto the idea of who you are based on what you repeatedly think and feel about yourself. If you consistently imagine yourself as stuck, the subconscious organizes behavior around that identity. If you consistently imagine yourself as capable, it begins to support that version of you through automatic choices, reactions, and instincts. This is why two people can face similar circumstances and end up in completely different outcomes, because their internal programming is not the same. And beneath all of this, there is a deeper layer of influence happening continuously, shaping reactions before awareness even catches up. What most people fail to realize is that the subconscious mind does not respond to effort in the way the conscious mind does. It does not change because you force it. It changes because you impress it. And the language of impression is not struggle, it is feeling, repetition, and vivid inner experience. Every result you see in your outer life is first formed as an inner impression long before it becomes physical reality. That means your imagination is not just fantasy, it is training your subconscious on what to accept as normal and what to reject as impossible. When you repeatedly see something in your mind with emotional intensity, your subconscious begins to treat that image as a memory rather than a possibility. This is where transformation begins. Because once something is accepted as memory, the subconscious no longer debates whether it is real or not. It begins to organize your thoughts, your emotions, and your actions around that internal picture. This is why visualization is not a passive exercise. It is a form of inner conditioning that slowly reshapes your entire behavioral system from within. Effort alone belongs to the conscious mind, but creation belongs to the subconscious. You can struggle all day trying to change habits, trying to force motivation, trying to discipline yourself through willpower, but if the subconscious image underneath remains the same, the change will not hold. It will collapse back into old patterns because the deeper layer of identity has not shifted. Real change happens when the inner image becomes stronger than the outer evidence. When what you see in your mind becomes more real than what you see in your environment, your entire system begins to reorganize itself to match that inner reality. This is why emotions are so important in this process. The subconscious does not respond strongly to dry thought alone. It responds to thought that is charged with feeling. When you feel something deeply while imagining it, you are essentially telling your subconscious that this is not just a thought, this is an experience. And experiences are what it builds reality from. This is also why negative emotions can be so powerful in shaping outcomes if they are repeated often. Fear, doubt, and anxiety are not just feelings, they are instructions being sent downward into the subconscious programming system. But the same principle works in reverse. When you deliberately create positive inner experiences with emotion, you begin to overwrite old patterns. You are not erasing the past, you are replacing its influence with a stronger signal. Over time, the subconscious begins to prioritize the newer, stronger impressions over the older ones. This is how transformation becomes natural instead of forced. The outer world always follows the inner image, not immediately, but inevitably. Because the subconscious mind does not work in time like the conscious mind. It works in accumulation. Every repeated image adds weight. Every repeated feeling adds direction. And eventually, the accumulation becomes expression. What once was only imagined begins to appear as circumstances, opportunities, behaviors, and outcomes that match the inner pattern. This is why mastery of the mind is not about control in a rigid sense. It is about guidance. It is about choosing what you repeatedly experience within yourself. Because whatever is experienced internally with consistency will eventually manifest externally without exception. The subconscious mind does not operate like a logical thinker. It operates like a recording system that absorbs experience without questioning its origin. For it, an image imagined with intensity can carry the same weight as an event physically lived. This is why visualization is not imagination in the casual sense. It is training the mind to accept future experience as present reality. When you close your eyes and imagine a scene with detail, your subconscious is not labeling it as false or real. It is simply storing it as experience. The nervous system reacts internally to imagined events in a way that mirrors real stimulation, creating emotional and physiological responses as if the experience is actually happening. This is the hidden mechanism behind fear created by thought and confidence built through repeated mental rehearsal. Every time you imagine failure repeatedly, the subconscious begins to store it as a familiar outcome, reducing resistance to that pattern in real life. The same principle applies to success, health, wealth, and emotional strength when these states are repeatedly experienced in vivid inner perception. The subconscious mind does not filter based on truth, it filters based on repetition and emotional intensity. If an imagined experience is repeated enough times with strong feeling, it begins to replace actual memories in influence and importance. This is why people often react emotionally to thoughts that have no physical presence but feel completely real within the body. The body responds to the imagination as though it is receiving actual signals from the environment, reinforcing the experience further. Over time, these repeated inner experiences begin to shape belief systems, which then guide perception and behavior without conscious awareness. What you consistently imagine becomes what you expect, and what you expect becomes what you unconsciously move towards. This is the bridge between imagination and manifestation, where internal experience gradually transforms into external reality. The repetition of mental imagery is more powerful than occasional physical effort because it speaks directly to the subconscious language system. When imagination becomes habitual, the subconscious begins to accept it as a baseline reality and adjust behavior accordingly. This is why deliberate mental practice can change personality traits over time without external pressure or force. A person who repeatedly imagines themselves calm begins to react calmly even in stressful environments because the inner script dominates the response system. The subconscious always chooses the strongest and most familiar pattern available, regardless of whether it was created consciously or unconsciously. That is why repetition with emotional clarity becomes the key to reshaping mental architecture from the inside out. Every inner picture you hold repeatedly becomes a silent instruction that the subconscious follows without hesitation or debate. Over time, this creates a complete shift in perception, where imagined reality begins to feel more natural than current circumstances. And as this internal transformation continues to deepen, the boundary between what is imagined and what is real begins to dissolve, making experience flow seamlessly from thought into beyond conscious awareness. Deep transformation of the subconscious mind does not happen in the ordinary waking state of tension and constant mental noise. It happens when the mind enters a slower rhythm, a quieter space where the constant analytical chatter of the conscious mind begins to fade. In that state, the subconscious becomes more receptive, more impressionable, and more open to new programming. This is because the critical filter of the conscious mind, which normally rejects or doubts new ideas, becomes less dominant. When that filter is reduced, the deeper mind can absorb thoughts, images, and suggestions more directly, without resistance or distortion. This is why moments of deep relaxation, just before sleep or in a calm meditative state, are so powerful for inner change. The brain shifts into slower brainwave patterns where imagination feels more real and inner experience becomes more influential than outer distractions. In this condition, even simple thoughts can leave deep impressions because the subconscious is no longer analyzing them, it is absorbing them as experience. In this relaxed inner state, imagination becomes more than mental activity. It becomes a form of communication with the deeper self. When you visualize your goals or desired identity while deeply relaxed, you are not just thinking about them, you are planting them directly into the system that governs habits, emotions, and automatic behavior. The subconscious does not respond to force, it responds to acceptance, and relaxation creates the environment where acceptance naturally occurs. When the body is calm and the mind is still, resistance disappears, and whatever you consistently focus on begins to sink deeper into the internal structure of belief. This process is not about escaping reality, but about reshaping the internal framework from which reality is interpreted. Every experience you have in life is filtered through the subconscious, and that filter determines how you react, what you notice, and what you ignore. By entering deep relaxation and introducing new mental images at that level, you are effectively rewriting the filter itself. Over time, this changes perception, and when perception changes, behavior changes without conscious effort. What once required discipline begins to happen naturally because the subconscious has accepted a new pattern as normal. The power of this state lies in its simplicity. There is no struggle, no argument, no mental resistance. Instead, there is absorption. The mind becomes like soft soil ready to receive seeds. Whatever is planted during this phase grows stronger because it is not competing with doubt or overthinking. The repetition of this practice creates cumulative effect, where each session reinforces the previous one, slowly reshaping the emotional baseline and identity structure of the individual. As this continues, the line between imagination and expectation begins to blur. What is repeatedly experienced in deep relaxation begins to feel more familiar than present circumstances. And the subconscious always moves toward what feels familiar, not what feels forced. This is why change that begins in deep inner calm becomes more stable and long-lasting than change driven by pressure or emotional intensity alone. Eventually, this state becomes a gateway where the inner world is intentionally designed rather than passively experienced. And from that design, the outer world begins to reorganize itself in response to the new internal blueprint. What you consistently visualize is not just a mental picture. It is a signal being sent into the deepest layers of your subconscious mind, where identity, belief, and behavior are continuously shaped. The subconscious does not work with occasional thoughts, it works with dominant patterns. Whatever image is repeated most often with emotional involvement becomes the dominant instruction that guides perception and action. This means that visualization is not a casual exercise of imagination. It is a form of inner repetition that gradually programs the direction of your life. Every time you return to a mental image with clarity and feeling, you are strengthening its influence over your automatic responses. The subconscious begins to recognize that image as familiar, and familiarity is the foundation upon which it builds behavior. It does not question whether that image is real or not. It only recognizes how often it appears and how strongly it is felt. When repetition combines with emotion, the subconscious gives it priority status, treating it as something important for survival and expression. Over time, this repeated inner experience becomes a reference point for decision making, shaping how you respond to opportunities, challenges, and even relationships. Without realizing it, you begin to act in ways that align with the internal image you have been feeding into your mind. This is why two people with the same external conditions can move in completely different directions in life, because their internal visualization patterns are not the same. One may repeatedly see struggle and limitation, while the other repeatedly sees growth and expansion, and each subconscious mind builds behavior accordingly. Visualization also influences expectation, and expectation is one of the strongest forces in human psychology. When you expect something, your mind begins to search for evidence that confirms it, filtering out anything that does not match. This creates a self-reinforcing loop where inner vision shapes outer perception, and outer perception strengthens inner belief. As this cycle continues, the imagined scenario begins to feel less like imagination and more like an inevitable direction. The subconscious starts preparing the body, emotions, and instincts to align with that expected reality, often before any external change has occurred. This is why visualization is not about pretending, it is about conditioning. It is about repeatedly exposing the subconscious to a version of reality until it no longer feels foreign. Once something becomes familiar internally, the mind naturally moves toward it externally. This movement is not forced, it is automatic because the subconscious always seeks to express what it knows most deeply. When visualization becomes consistent, it gradually replaces old internal patterns that were formed by past experiences or environmental conditioning. Each new mental image weakens the influence of older beliefs that no longer match the direction you are focusing on. Over time, the strongest repeated vision becomes the new foundation of identity, and identity shapes every action without the need for conscious effort or struggle. The life you experience begins to reflect not what you occasionally think about, but what you consistently see within yourself as already true. At the deepest level of human experience, transformation does not begin with action in the outer world. It begins with a shift in the inner identity that governs all action. The subconscious mind holds this identity in place through accumulated patterns of thought, emotion, and repeated inner experience. Whatever you consistently accept about yourself becomes the silent instruction that shapes your habits, decisions, and reactions without requiring conscious effort. This is why change that focuses only on behavior often feels unstable, because behavior is the surface expression of something much deeper. When the inner structure remains unchanged, old patterns eventually return, no matter how much effort is applied on the surface. True transformation begins when the subconscious identity itself is rewritten through repetition, emotional engagement, and sustained inner focus. Every thought you allow to repeat becomes a small reinforcement of identity. Every emotional reaction you reinforce becomes a deeper layer of belief. Over time, these layers build a mental structure that defines what feels possible and what feels impossible. The subconscious does not respond to arguments or logic. It responds to experience, especially internal experience that is repeated with feeling. This is why imagination is not separate from reality creation. It is the starting point of it. When you repeatedly experience a new version of yourself in your inner world, the subconscious begins to accept it as a potential reality. At first, it resists because it is unfamiliar, but with consistency, resistance weakens and acceptance grows. Once acceptance occurs, behavior naturally begins to align with the new identity without force or struggle. This is the point where transformation feels effortless, because it is no longer being driven by conscious willpower, but by subconscious agreement. The mind always seeks consistency, and when the inner picture becomes consistent enough, the subconscious reorganizes perception to match it. What once felt like imagination begins to feel like direction. What once felt distant begins to feel natural. As this process deepens, external circumstances start reflecting the internal shift, not because reality is being forced, but because perception itself has changed. The subconscious filters experience based on what it believes to be true, so when belief changes, the interpretation of reality also changes. New opportunities become visible, new decisions feel intuitive, and old limitations lose their emotional power. This is not sudden change, but continuous alignment between inner identity and outer experience. The more consistent the inner focus, the more stable the transformation becomes. Eventually, the gap between who you were and who you are becoming begins to dissolve, because the subconscious has fully accepted the new pattern as its operating reality. At that point, living in alignment with your new identity is no longer something you try to do. It becomes the natural expression of who you are without conscious effort or resistance.